So, dear respected Thay, dear Laura, dear community. So we're very happy that late last night, Laura Hassler arrived from Alkmaar, from the Netherlands. And we met more than 10 years ago.
I think so, yeah.
In Upper Hamlet in Plum Village, when there was a group from the Fellowship of Reconciliation, or a film team working with FOR, that or something like that.
Something like that, yes.
That was making a kind of almost animated feature about your father and Thay, your father, Alfred Hassler, and Thay and Suko Chang-kong about their work in the 60s and early 70s.
Yeah, it was a documentary, and it included historic footage, interviews with various people, including myself and Sister Chang-kong, and also Thay, interviews with him as well. And for the pieces of the story where the people, such as my father, weren't alive anymore to be interviewed, they made animated and pieces out of the past. This wonderful cartoon drawing guy did this.
Yeah.
And so it's a beautiful documentary. Maybe we can look at it at some point.
Yeah, it'd be great to find time to show it here. We had it's more than 10 years ago it came out, I think.
I think so, 2014.
In Lower Hamlet, we had I don't know if you were there for the debut.
Yes, I was. Yes, and I was in New York when they did the edited version a couple of years later in the Harlem Film Festival, where it won an award. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. I think I did the voice for an American government agent or something.
Oh.
And, when your father meets with Tai Tri Quang and
in Saigon,
in Saigon, yeah. They needed an American
voice
to play the government. So please enjoy some tea.
Thank you.
So just to share a little about Laura and her father. So, well, first of all, Laura, one of her passions in life work has been creating Musicians Without Borders, which is a really, I think, revolutionary organization. Really bringing musicians from all over the world to places of conflict, to bring peace and understanding and connection.
Especially working with musicians in those places of conflict to create community and to help to heal some of the wounds of war, especially with children and young people, but also adults,
Yeah, so it is very beautiful work, and I got to see some of the work. I think you were working with Tina Turner, or that was, or a different group?
That's a different group, yes.
Okay.
We're in touch with that group too, yes.
Okay.
It's a small world.
That was with children. And
yes.
Yeah.
Now we're working in the Balkans, where we started, in the Middle East, Jordan and Palestine, about which I hope to say a few words at some point, and Central Eastern Africa, in Rwanda and Democratic Republic Congo. We had a project for 4.5 years in El Salvador, using music to help create spaces, culture of nonviolence within music classrooms, so training music teachers how they could use their musical gifts to make children feel safe and welcome and part of a community. So that it's that kind of work.
Yeah, and so I think this interview will go back to your teenage years, maybe, and childhood, to talk about your father a bit, and then move forward to how that led to your current path and work. So maybe I'll start off, but you will be able to fill in the blanks much better than I can. So in short, Alfred Hassler is Laura's father. I feel really a great American and great citizen, global citizen, who made a rare and difficult choice as a young man to be a conscientious objector during World War II, which was not the same as being a conscientious objector during Vietnam, when it became more socially acceptable. And he spent many months,
9 months in a federal penitentiary, and at top security,
in
federal penitentiary.
penitentiary
Which
during
had been
World
his
War II.
request also. He said, if I'm going to prison, send me to a real prison, not to one of these day camps where you send all the other conchis.
Yeah.
Because he wanted to know what prison was. And after that, he wrote a book about it.
Yeah, that's right. That was his first book.
His first book, yes.
Yeah. Which, what was the title?
Diary of a Self-Made Convict.
Diary of a, yeah. So a hugely unpopular choice to make.
Hugely.
During the war, that was kind of in a way, the heyday of the United States on the world scene when the United States intervened in World War II.
But he was already working for the Fellowship of Reconciliation, which...
He was, okay.
Yes, for several years. He was head of publications. And so that was a community. And other colleagues like Bayard Rustin, for example, who was the Martin Luther King's strategic advisor. Right. He also went to prison as a conscientious objector.
He did? Okay.
Yes. George Hauser, who was one of our neighbors when I was growing up, who worked as the youth secretary or race relations secretary of FOR and was part of the very first Freedom Ride, which is 1947 through the South.
And 1947?
Yes. Yes.
What?
I think George and Bayard were both on that Freedom Ride, and George was also a CO, also went to prison. So it wasn't like he was all alone. I mean, there was a community, and my father was 34 by this point. Also, it wasn't like he was a young draftee. It was the end of the war when he was called up, and by that point, he had gotten to this feeling like opposing war had to also include opposing the systems that make war possible, which was the draft. And he also knew that in the Second World War, which, of course, all of the movies and books and everything that have been made about it, just about, are all about good versus evil, and we were the good guys. Yeah. But pacifists were warning this was going to happen because they saw these historical developments long before. And many people were warning about this, and the merciless Versailles Accords at the end of the First World War, which punished Germany enormously and led to recession and poverty and so forth. I mean, these were paths, and then I think his position was not only oppose this war, but it is not fair to then point to people and say, you're a coward or you're a traitor. After all of these years of voices saying, this is going to go the wrong way, and then it did. Yeah. And then to say, okay, now you have to pick up a gun.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So maybe could you give us a little bit of the history of the Fellowship of Reconciliation? My understanding, it was at the beginning of World War I.
Yes, it started World War I. It was originally, the story is that it was originally an agreement between a British cleric, pastor, Protestant minister, and a German one, and they were friends. And at the outbreak of World War I, they agreed that they would hold on to their friendship, whatever happened, and they would continue to work for peace. Mm-hmm. And I think that the actual first meeting that founded the FOR happened in the Netherlands in 1918. I think that's when it actually sort of started. But it was those two guys sort of vowing to hold on to their commitment to peace and to social activism, and then coming together. Yeah, and it was for a long time. It was really Protestant Christian based, and I know my father was one of the people who, in the 50s and 60s, was also leading the push to expand. I remember him saying, there's so few pacifists in the world. Why do we have to divide it into smaller groups? Why can't we work together? And finally that succeeded. And it became interreligious. And then there grew gradually. I mean, first they allowed the Catholics and the Jews to enter, and then later the Buddhists and the Muslims and even the agnostics. So it became anybody who had like a spiritual basis to their commitment to nonviolence and pacifism. And then the War Resisters League, which was based in New York City and still exists also, FOR still exists also. That was more the secular nonviolence pacifist movement. And then the international FOR, because there are fellowships of reconciliation around the world, and the IFOR, became sort of you could say, the secretariat for that network, and would try to pull people together. And
at the end of his career, he was
both.
Had both.
He was executive secretary of the American FOR, and he was also, for a while, he was executive director of the IFOR. That didn't mean all that much, but it did mean, in the context of Vietnam, I mean, these are mostly, the American branch was always the biggest branch.
Oh, okay.
And I think at the height, they had maybe 70,000 members, something like that. It wasn't millions. But it was at the beginning of many things. The FOR was, I believe, the organization that sprouted the ACLU, which was originally an FOR committee on human rights.
Okay.
The American Committee on Christians and Jews, I don't know if that still exists, but that was an FOR committee. Congress of Racial Equality, Jim Lawson used to work for FOR, and CORE grew out of that.
Okay.
And I even remember my dad going to London for a meeting of various organizations, international organizations, all of whom had as one of their sort of programs work on behalf of conscientious objectors and political prisoners. And what came out of that is an organization called Amnesty International, because they felt like there should be an organization for this issue. Because FOR did everything, they did nonviolence training for Dr. King's movement. They worked on human rights and conscientious objectors' rights. Of course, every war that came along, they were working in opposition of that. But there were a number of issues which were so, FOR was really based on an overall commitment to pacifism, to nonviolence, and refusal to use violence against other human beings. And they recognized that, for the issue of human rights and conscientious objectors, there would be a much broader audience and needed that. So I think that's my understanding.
So the FOR is sprouting off most of the heartfelt and transformative non-governmental institutions
that had their beginnings in the FOR. Yeah. Ironically, FOR is now quite small.
Yeah.
Well, I also think in some ways, I think it reached its largest point during the Vietnam War, and this is just me, but I believe that the what could you say? There was a huge conflict and split within the American and the Western peace movement on the issue of Vietnam, and that split FOR. And I think that did not do it well. I think that was part of the reason that it afterwards fell apart. Also, the fact that my father retired, because he was a good leader.
Yeah, right.
And I'm not sure that afterwards that there were, I don't know, I don't want to say anything, I don't know, I didn't know all the people who followed, but yeah, to hold that kind of an organization together, you have to keep reinventing yourself.
And he was trained as a journalist.
Yeah.
So could you share a little bit about that?
Well, actually, he started out in an engineering school and then and he loved to write. And this was during the Depression. And then he went to Columbia School of Journalism. I don't think he ever got a degree, but it was because he was out on the streets and he needed to earn money. And he went from writing for a number of different New York newspapers to working for a Baptist publishing house. In the same period, he met my mom.
He's Baptist background.
He was a Baptist. Yeah, later he called himself a Buddhist Baptist after the friendship with Thay began. Yeah, he said, "I'm now a Buddhist Baptist." But he was a Baptist who had left the church at a young age, and my mother was a Presbyterian who had left the church at a young age, both because they were disappointed with their churches for not coming out against World War II, against war. And they met in a choir. They were both amateur singers.
In New York City.
In New York City, yeah. I think in Queens, but I'm not sure. But they met in a choir, and she introduced him to the FOR. She was a member of a youth club or something like that. And that's how that relationship started. Well, how two relationships started, I guess you could say. So, and then for a while he worked for this Baptist publishing house, and then he went to work for the FOR. And I'm not sure exactly how that went, but he became their head of publications. It was called then. We would call it communications these days.
Right, and it was already based in Nyack, New York. No, not yet.
No, it was in New York City on Audubon Avenue. I know because as a small child, he often took me there to the office, which was a great big treat for me. And I guess so after the Second World War, my parents and two other couples wanted to move out of New York City and start families. And they together formed a cooperative and decided they wanted to move to the country, which was very close to the city at that point. And by the time they started, I think they had 9 couples, and they bought some land together, and they started a cooperative community in Rockland County, which is about, you measure distance in time here these days. Well, anyway, it's about 25, 35 miles north of New York City. So they moved there after the end of the war, and after my father I think they had to do 2 years of working as an orderly in a hospital because he had a 3-year sentence and he only served 9 months, and then he was on parole. But after that, they moved there and built houses, and that's where I grew up. And because then I think several of the FOR staff were also living in that community, and they were driving in and out of New York to New York City every day. And so they started looking around, and my dad found this mansion, beautiful riverside mansion in Nyack, New York, that was owned by some descendants of a very wealthy family. And it was for sale for back taxes. And he bought it, as I remember, for $23,000 on this gorgeous piece of land overlooking the Hudson River. And I remember as a kid, going there, and there's this curving stairway with like a jungle wallpaper, and there was a pipe organ, and there was a chapel in this house that had been lived in by 3 people with 27 live-in servants, or 17. Anyway, it was crazy. Little telephones, old-fashioned telephones with buttons in all the rooms so you could call the servants, And that became the FOR headquarters, yeah.
Sounds like something out of The Great Gatsby.
Oh, it was amazing. It was really amazing. But it was much easier than for the staff who lived in outside of New York by that point. There was an enormous move of people out of New York City into the suburbs afterwards, I guess out of all the major cities after the Second World War.
Okay, so he moved the office there.
In 1958, if I'm correct.
1958. Okay, so that was... So the next part I'm aware of is he's head of publications, and then he makes the drive to publish this comic book about the Montgomery bus boycott. Could you share a little bit about that?
Sure. So this is kind of funny because we weren't allowed to have comic books as kids. Because Alfred we started calling him Alfred when my grandfather and grandparents came to live, because my grandfather, who was suffering dementia, although we didn't know the name then, he would go through the house going, Alfred, Alfred, Alfred. So we started doing it too, and he kind of liked it, so we kept doing that. We didn't call him Daddy anymore. So anyway, Alfred considered this a lower form of literature, and he wanted his children to read books, not comic books. But I think he understood the power of the medium, because we would be sneaking off every weekend to our friends' houses to sit out in their sheds and read comic books all weekend. And he came up with this idea shortly after the Montgomery bus boycott, which was really when Martin Luther King emerged as leader of the civil rights movement in the South. And the FOR had been supporting Dr. King with, especially with sending nonviolent trainers. Bayard Rustin had been, and Jim Lawson had been sort of between those two organizations, between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and the FOR. George Hauser, of course. So there were loads of connections. And when the boycott ended successfully, because does everybody know about this boycott? So yeah, okay. So because the buses had been segregated before, and the Rosa Parks story and so forth. And it lasted for something like a year, and they won.
Right.
That was a nonviolent
It started
boycott.
right in, because Dr. King had been appointed pastor of a church in Montgomery, right? He decided rather than to go to Michigan or somewhere up north, made the difficult decision to accept the, what is it, Dexter something church?
I'm not sure.
And
I
then
don't know all the
that
details,
became the locus, the center of that boycott.
Well, it really started with Rosa Parks, who was also a civil rights activist. She wasn't just some woman who decided not to give up her seat.
Yeah.
And there were many women involved in that movement as well. Yeah. But so what happened, I think, in Alfred, if you ask what characterized my father the most, I would say it was his sense of humor. And I don't only mean telling corny jokes, which he did, but I mean a kind of a sense of seeing yourself in perspective, not taking yourself too seriously. And I think that, but there's a link between that and creativity. And he was incredibly creative. So he was coming up with all of these ideas to make things more visible or more urgent or more accessible. And the comic book was his idea about how to spread the story of that Montgomery bus boycott and of the power of nonviolence to confront segregation, and to spread it in such a way that it would be accessible to everybody, not just to people who read the New York Times. So he had this idea about the comic book. He wrote the text of the comic book. He found, because they were always struggling with money, of course. I sometimes think this is the main gene that I inherited from my father, is hopelessly looking for funding for important things. But he persuaded somebody at the Al Cap Studios, which is a very famous cartoon and animation studio, to do the drawings for free. Yeah. And he found a comic writer, because he wasn't a comic writer. Obviously, you need to know how to put the dialogue into those little boxes, who had been blacklisted because this was the McCarthy period. So there were a lot of artists and out of work. Yeah. And he found a guy, I don't remember his name, but I'll come up with it at some point, who to do that, and hired him. And he was in touch with Dr. King. There's some letters exchanged about that. And they produced this comic book. I have one in my bag, a copy, which we can look at later, called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And
it's fantastic.
Yeah.
I've read it many times.
Yeah, and what's also funny is that sometimes things that you do, almost always things that you do, take on a life of their own. So after my father had passed away, I found out at some point I was in a struggle about whether my own organization was going to survive, and somebody sent me a link to an online site about comic books. And there was this story about how this comic book had been picked up by a Muslim American youth organization who were connected to an organization in Cairo, in Egypt, who were working for human rights in Egypt. And they had the comic book translated into Arabic and published, and they were using it in Egypt to train young Egyptian activists who would later then be involved in the Tahrir Square demonstrations in the Arab Spring. And it was translated into Spanish. It was used in the liberation movements in Latin America.
Also in South Africa, no? Was it?
I think so. South Africa.
I thought I remember.
I have copies in Arabic and in Farsi. Okay. So this comic book sort of took on a life of its own, which is kind of funny, and I'm sure he's laughing up there somewhere. But I think that, the comic book, that idea, there was, another one of my favorite stories is the grain bag story. Can I tell that story?
The Johnson administration, right? Was it?
No.
It was Eisenhower. Eisenhower
in the 50s. Right. So this was like 1953, I want to say, 54. And this was the height of the Cold War. Well, the height of the Cold War continued for a long time, but there was a lot of huge anti-communism, fear of communists being spread, just like these days fear of terrorists is spread, fear of, there's always got to be some scary enemy out there, right, to keep the war machine moving. And in 53 or 54, there was this horrible famine in China, and the huge starvation was a real possibility.
The great leap forward, I think.
Sorry?
It was the great leap forward, yeah.
Possibly, I
so,
don't know.
yeah.
But anyway, and so the FOR started a campaign called Food for China. And because in the same year, there had been overproduction of grain in the U.S., and what they were doing was they were storing the surplus grain in old warships so as not to drive the price down in the U.S. So they started this campaign to send this surplus grain to China as a gesture from people to save lives. And Alfred had the idea, okay, how do we make this, sort of strong and interesting and visible? And he came up with the idea of producing miniature grain bags. So the FOR produced all these little burlap, this big little grain bags. I still have one at home with a tag on it. And on the bag was printed a quote from the Bible that said, "If thine enemy hunger, feed him." And the tag was addressed to President Eisenhower and said, under that biblical quote said, "Send surplus food to China." And then the tag was addressed to the White House, to the president, and you would fill the bag, you as person would fill the bag with rice or beans or corn or something and tie it up and then put your name on that tag and send it to the White House. Campaign failed. They heard nothing. Although, they did it for like a year and a half. And there were also petitions, and there were women's groups, and there were religious groups, and it wasn't that it didn't take on among people, but the government didn't do anything with it. And something like 10 years later, by chance, my father met somebody who had worked, I think, as a press officer for Eisenhower during that period. And they got to talking. And the guy tells a story when he hears about this grain bag thing. He says, "Well, I have something to tell you." He was present at a meeting in that same period when the president was meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and they were urging him to bomb China because there was a political conflict around two islands in the South China Sea, Kemoe Matsu, and the generals wanted, of course, to attack. And this was being discussed at this meeting. And at a certain point, the president turns to his assistant and he says, "How many of those grain bags did we get in?" And the guy says, 60,000 and all these petitions and all these letters. And Eisenhower says, sorry, everything makes me cry these days. Eisenhower says, if there are that many Americans who care that much about Chinese people, we can't bomb them. The plan was off the table. So, but for that chance meeting, he never would have known. It didn't do what they had intended, but it did something maybe more important. It stopped a war.
Maybe we can listen to the sound of the bell. We'll listen to the sound of the bell. Yeah, the phrase that comes to me is that your dad is one of the most consequential Americans that most people know nothing about.
Well, it's also why there's a plan. I haven't really done any work on it yet, but a very distant cousin discovered that he was related to my father and wrote to me and said, I discovered that there hasn't been a biography written about him yet, and I'd like to do that. And we've talked a couple of times, and now we've decided to do it together because I've got the stories and he's the researcher. And So it's interesting. This runs a little bit parallel, your project.
Well, we can send him this video too, so he can.
Yeah.
So okay, so the part we'll kind of come into now is how your father got involved with the Vietnam War. So in, I think, 1955 or 65, he, on behalf of FOR, he actually traveled to Vietnam.
Right.
And so my understanding is FOR had this mission, which was when two countries are in war with each other, that they try to send representatives to bring about a peaceful situation to either country. I don't know if that, something like that.
I don't.
Or was he the first to do something like that?
I don't actually know whether there were any other initiatives coming from the U.S. I don't think that. I think what he was trying to do was, first of all, to find out whether there were any allies for people in the peace movement here in Vietnam that they could work with.
To who want peace.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. It was 1965. That was Lyndon Johnson was escalating the war, and I think people like my father were very alarmed at that, and they wanted to know more about the situation. So what he did was he organized a visit with about, I think, 8 or 10 different religious leaders from the U.S. Jim Lawson was on that trip, by the way. Yeah, and I have a picture of it somewhere. And they went, and while they were there, somehow they got to the An Quang Pagoda, and they met Thich Tri Quang, and they met Thich Nhat Hanh.
Okay.
And there was a real click there. Mm. And then I believe it was what they were so-called fact-finding mission for the American peace scene, you could say.
I think he called Thay the brain trust of Thich Tri Quang, something like that.
Can very well be. And then I think it was the following year that Thay was invited to Cornell University to teach, and Alfred persuaded him to stay and to do a speaking tour. And then,
so that wasn't the plan from the outside?
I'm not sure exactly.
That's what I'm curious about.
Well, I mean, I was at college and I was 18, and I don't know all of the history. Right. Could probably find it because I've got all the bound copies of Fellowship, and I've got lots of correspondence in folders and stuff like that, which I couldn't all bring with me, but okay. But it led to the beginning of a relationship between the FOR and the Vietnamese Buddhist movement, and a personal relationship between Alfred and Thay, which was a very strong one. Mm-hmm.
So let's first talk a little bit about that meeting of when your father went in 65 to An Quang Pagoda. So he met Thich Tri Quang. Thich Tri Quang was, we'll learn about in the class, is probably, after Yim fell, I think maybe the most influential person in all of Vietnam, at least in South Vietnam.
Quite possibly so.
Yeah, he could basically call out thousands of people, Buddhist young people, to march in the streets after. So what happened, we'll go into this in the course, but basically Yim, who is kind of strong man, Catholic, I think his brother or cousin was a bishop, who was really almost forcing Catholicism on the population.
There's a lot of repression of the Buddhist
repression, right? Majority, so specifically in 1963, I think it was 63, the Vesak was banned. The Buddhists were not allowed to show the Buddhist flag, which was relatively new, actually. We should say the Buddhist flag was a new innovation, but they were not, and also celebrations of the Buddha's birthday were not allowed in that May. So, and so in protest, many, including our grandfather teacher, Thay's teacher, walked out to the streets in March. We have photos of our Suko, we say our grandpa teacher, walking in the streets of Hue to protest that, and so that basically brought about all those tens of thousands of Buddhists walking in the streets to protest the repression of Vesak, brought about the collapse, actually, of the Yim regime, finally.
But I think it's also so that this was also combined with a very strong Buddhist protest against the war and the American presence that was going on. And that included those self-immolations.
Yeah.
And
Thich Wan Duc.
but
Many
also
others.
Nhat later. And, so I think that the repression of the Buddhists was also connected to the fact that Diem was propped up by the U.S. government, who had taken over,
Right.
you could say, the military occupation of South Vietnam from the French.
That's right.
I mean, the French had lost the Vietnamese War of Independence in 1954, and there had been an agreement that Vietnam would be temporarily divided, and that there would be elections. And then, under the pressure of the Americans took over from the French. Under the pressure of the Americans, no elections were held. So South Vietnam was seen as a stronghold against communism.
Right. Yeah.
And Diem was there.
And Diem was very happy about that. He wanted to keep power in South Vietnam. He didn't want the country to be unified. And just to say, we recently found out that Thay, that spring after the immolation of Thich Wan Duc, actually planned to immolate himself.
Oh, really?
I don't know if you knew that.
No, I didn't know this.
While he was in Colombia, Thay made all the plans, and it was actually one day. Thay writes about it in his memoirs, but he didn't ever, as far as I know, teach us or tell us about it.
I've never heard it.
Yeah. Thay thought that if he immolated himself, that in the United States, in New York City, that would be enough to bring about a worldwide global response that, Thich Wan Duc's immolation had started.
Right.
And so, in fact, Thay writes that this Professor Fries, who was one of his mentors and advisors at Columbia, that day Thay went to his office, and Professor Fries asked Thay, who's a teacher on the philosophy of ethics, and he asked Thay how his friends were doing in Vietnam, and then how was he doing, and Thay knew he could not tell even this man who was so compassionate and kind to him what he had been planning. He had not told anyone. And then at some point, Professor Fries says, "Thank goodness, Thay, you are here to be a voice for those who don't have a voice." And he puts his hand on Thay's shoulder. And Thay said it was like an electric shock going through his body. And then he was so shaken by it that he went walking from Columbia down to 109th Street, where he was living in an apartment with Stephen Headley. And when he arrived at 109th Street, he abandoned his idea to immolate himself. So we only learned about that about 2 years ago, when that bit of Thay's memoir was published in Thay's the biography in Vietnamese. So that period was very emotional for Thay, for all Buddhists in Vietnam, and so following that, your father comes in 1965 to An Quang Pagoda. An Quang Pagoda, we'll learn, is the kind of center of all these activities, and so I've had a chance to be there a few times. Thay brought us there, and that. Eventually, the university which Thay founds, Van Hanh University, is founded in An Quang Pagoda. But even in the 50s already, it's an institute of Buddhist studies. And Thay's teaching there, and Thay's invited after the Geneva Accords to design the curriculum for the students there, which includes science and Western science and philosophy. So things that hadn't ever been taught to monastics before. So it's a place of innovation. An Quang Pagoda was a space where Thay could experiment with a new kind of monastic education. And so your father comes there, and Thay Tri Quang, who is also from Hue, who had been the main one calling for people the Buddhists to go out in the streets, which eventually ends with the Yim regime collapsing, is also there. And so they're working somewhat in collaboration. In fact, it's because of Thay Tri Quang that Thay comes back from Colombia. He gets a letter from Thay Tri Quang saying, I have done is all I can. I put all my trust in Nhat Hanh. And so Thay, and then somehow a plane ticket appears. And Thay, even though Thay knew he was going back into kind of the mouth of the beast, as it were, he wrote a poem saying, I know I naively go back with my arms open, knowing that, what might happen. And so Thay returned and then met your father came in 1965. And so you want to add anything about that?
You know more about this than I do.
Sorry.
Yeah. No, I think, like I said, that this was really the beginning of this personal connection.
Yeah.
And then I think Alfred made that happen, and because he had representatives with him from the different religious groups that were part of FOR or connected to FOR, he was also kind of building a base.
Right.
So he got that. He had that support then. Also, he's quite strategic as well as having a good sense of humor.
Yeah. Well, I tell you, so it's just happenstance. This past spring, we've been doing these week-long events at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire for the past couple of years, and I was there in the spring with a bunch of sisters, actually giving them a tour of campus because I went there as an undergrad, and anyway, and I said I wanted to show them the library, and they said, "Oh, well, can we see where Thay's books are in the library?" So I said, "Oh, sure, okay." And we'll go into the stacks, and we went looking into the section about Vietnam, and we're looking at a bunch of books, and then I see this book, and it's called Saigon, USA, and I take it out, and it's by Alfred Hassler, and I think, what? How come I've never heard of this book? And now this summer, the young brothers, it's been a reading assignment actually for them. I've been buying up used copies wherever I could find them.
I do that too. I have about 10 of them, yes.
Because
I wanted all my grandchildren to have
it's
one.
By far, I feel, the most accessible and kind of inside, real, like from a peace activist himself, really much more precious for me than a historical book about the Vietnam War. It's really Alfred's lived experience going to meet with Thich Nhat Hanh and Thay, and then really, I mean, there's so much about Thay in there. I mean, he really became influenced, I think, as well by Thay's way of thinking.
Oh,
and
very much so.
The world. Yeah,
very much so. Yeah.
Yeah, and so but that book is until 1970. So Thay comes over in 1966, and then to teach at Cornell, and then your father starts to arrange for him to have meetings, including to meet with Dr. Martin Luther King in Chicago, as well as Robert Lowell and Arthur Miller and other notables. So that was Thay's first meeting with Dr. King. Right. So Thay had written a letter to Dr. King, but apparently Dr. King had not read it, or didn't remember it. And so Thay was able to give that letter again to Dr. King. And I don't know if you know, in the Southern Christian Leadership Council didn't support him. Nobody
in the civil rights movement was for it, because they were, I mean, you can understand it, because it was only a couple of years after the Civil Rights Act, which they had succeeded in getting through Congress, which basically forbade segregation in the United States. And they had worked so hard to get that far. And I was at that march in Washington in 1963 as a 15-year-old, the I Have a Dream march. And they had become so good in pulling together all of these different groups of people, artists and Jewish organizations and unions, and to support the SCLC and the civil rights movement, and all of this coalition of Black rights organizations. And they'd gotten this. I mean, it was still legal to forbid Black people from coming into restaurants until 1965. So that King saw these connections and felt the moral obligation to speak out about it. And his cohorts were opposed to it because they were afraid that he would lose the support of President Johnson, who was kind of on his side. And that is what happened, in fact. And, I think with this we've seen this with a number of American leaders who are charismatic, who are able to mobilize people behind them, and who start connecting the issues, start connecting the dots, and leave behind that sort of single issue. If you're only talking about desegregating restaurants and buses, okay, we can manage that. But if you're talking about the power of the U.S. military across the world and how it was largely Black people in those armies, many, and poor people.
Very high percentage.
Yes. And the whole system of which was exploiting not only Vietnam, but many countries around the world. Then you become a real threat. And I think it's very interesting that you see a lot of these. I mean, it wasn't within a span of just only in the 60s. Malcolm X, both Kennedy brothers, Jack Kennedy, president, and Robert Kennedy, when it seemed like he was going to move towards, both of whom intended to stop the Vietnam War and reverse the Cold War, and John Kennedy had established this personal connection with Khrushchev from the Soviet Union, and they had been talking about their care for their children and their grandchildren. And so this was these people. They were all shot. They were all executed. And okay, so there. But this connection, I think that it was very clear that King coming out against the Vietnam War clearly and against American militarism, because he speaks much more widely. You can hear it. It's called Beyond Vietnam. Is the name of the speech. It's online. It's very moving. So anyway, yes, but it was. I think it was Thich Nhat Hanh who was responsible for that. And so if you trace down I don't even want to think about that, but okay. Yeah.
So, and so meanwhile, this relationship is growing between Al and Thay.
Yeah.
And I was so happy with the help of one of our research assistants for the course, Jasdeep Kaur. We found the FOR archives in Swarthmore. And we found this kind of treasure trove of letters between Al and Thay. When Thay in 66, 67, Thay's in Hong Kong, then in Japan. Thay's moving around without a passport, trying to get a visa extension in Hong Kong. And then when that no longer works, he goes to Japan, eventually ends up in Paris, and always keeping in touch with your father. And it's just beautiful to read Thay's letters are handwritten and Al's are all type.
With two
and
fingers.
I just enjoyed so much. So that's material that we want to make available to the course, just because I love to read the direct correspondence.
Nice.
Nice. So so in that, Al is helping to send Thay the royalties from Lotus in a Sea of Fire. So your father helped to publish that book.
He also helped to write it.
He also helped to, well, see, that's something that helps me to understand a bit, because that the tone of that book is so distinct from Thay's other writing. When we pick it up and read it, we wonder, oh my goodness, I've never read Thay talking like this.
I think he was the ghostwriter. I mean, he didn't publish anything that Thay didn't agree with.
Of course, yeah. Well, in our experience, also my experience working on books and articles with Thay is Thay kind of we would work on it and edit something. And one time Thay told me directly, if Thay students, you can make up 20%. It's okay. But that was for oral translation, not for books. We didn't do it in books, but Thay always reviewed it, and Thay would, Thay would look over and make marks and suggest changes and so forth. But Thay saw writing not just as an individual endeavor. And that's actually he's part of a movement, and it's a collective. And so and as we're studying now about when Thay was first editor of this Buddhist Vietnam journal, he was writing about half the articles under different pen names, right? So Thay is quite open about how the writing got out under whatever name.
Right.
Okay, so that I'm glad you confirmed that your father's participation.
I'm
Because
sure.
the
I'm
book was
sure.
just republished, by the
Oh,
way,
nice.
reissued, a new edition.
I
Yeah,
have one of the old ones somewhere on a shelf here.
yeah. So Lotus in a Sea of Fire. It's really, I think, bringing together material from many of Thay's talks that he was giving, and your father was arranging for him to go around the U.S. and Europe to speak about the war in Vietnam for this kind of third force.
Yeah.
Which was speaking not for the North or the South, but for a cessation of all hostilities.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and then Al, in those letters, he's talking about getting material for his own book, Saigon, USA, which describes his experience meeting Thay and then working with Thay later on. I wanted to ask you because in one of the letters he mentions that he wants to interview Thay and Chi Fung, which is Sister Shen Kong, and at least the two of them. And so he talks about meeting up with them to do, cassette recordings. And I'm kind of thinking, are those cassettes anywhere?
I don't know. I don't have them.
Because we recently found the cassettes that I don't know if I told you that Jim
Nancy Forrest.
Yeah, Nancy has these cassettes in her
attic. She's my neighbor. Huh? We know each other.
Right.
She's the other grandmother for our family.
Yeah. Yes. So we've done it. I did an interview with her, and anyway,
with Dan Berrigan.
Right, with Dan Berrigan, exactly. So when Dan came out of jail and he came to stay with Thay in nearby Paris, and then they had these evenings and Jim would record it. And
I was there.
You were there too.
I was there. And then Jim and Dan and I together went to England for a conference in that period, and I think that sort of reignited the connection between Thay and Father Dan. Yeah.
So anyway, it's still pending whether those cassette tapes. If your father did in fact interview Thay on cassette for Saigon, USA, it would be.
I will check my drawer full of cassettes again. I don't remember having it though.
Okay. It's not sure that he did it. He said he intended to do it, so it's not clear whether he did or not. Okay, so then, the next stage I want to go into is this Dai Dong movement. So I think in 1970, right? So Al, your father, takes a Vietnamese term, Dai Dong, and uses that as the kind of title, really, for movement, an environmental movement.
Yeah.
This is way before hardly anybody has heard of climate change or anything, right? So in Menton in France, they have a conference.
Yes.
And your father helps to organize it.
Yeah.
And Thay is there and speaks, as well as Siko Chan Kong as a biologist and scientist. So could you share a little bit about your memory of that?
Yes. So it was in Menton because we had a connection in Menton. We had, just before the war got more intense, 1965, Alfred had a sabbatical leave, and there was a woman, an old British woman, who lived outside of Nice in southern France. Her name was Ethelwyn Best.
Oh, right.
And Alfred had sent her to South Vietnam to be a spy for him, to bring back information, basically. This was pre-internet days. All letters were opened. All telephones were tapped. You needed a personal somebody to get information in and out. And Ethelwyn was this old lady. She was wonderful. She had a wonderful sense of humor also. She lived outside of Nice. So Alfred had managed to get her into South Vietnam to bring out news and then to bring back news, to be basically a conduit between him and Thay and the people in Vietnam. And so Ethelwyn was living in that region, and when my father had this sabbatical, which, I mean, he'd worked for them for like 30 years or something, I don't know how long, but, and he really needed some time off, and Ethelwyn found us a house to live in Menton, which is right next to the Italian border. So we were off as a family for, in this wonderful, beautiful villa that it was off season, so, nobody was renting, so that kind of stuff. And so he had some connections in Menton still, and he had to cut his sabbatical short because of the war, of the violence increasing, the American presence increasing. So we went back to the U.S. a month earlier or 2 months earlier than we would have gone. And the connection to Menton came from that period and from Ethel and Best.
Okay.
So probably, he knew some places where people could stay. I mean, everything was always done that way through contacts and being able to manage. But they organized. I don't know how exactly. I don't remember all of the stories. But the idea was to connect the issues. And to bring scientists and experts about climate and environment together to talk about the threats to the globe and also the interrelationship between those threats and the threat of war. By the way, you see all of these climate conferences, the COP21, COP20, whatever, and you might notice if you follow them that the largest polluter in the world happens to be the U.S. military. But the military is never included in these climate accords. Never mentioned. So they, again, like King in his speech, they were trying to connect these issues. And they had a conference in Menton in 1970, I believe, and in 1971 was the first UN climate conference that was held in Stockholm, Sweden, and they organized a parallel conference, Daidang, also in Stockholm, and brought many of the same scientists who were at the UN conference to this Daidang conference. And at the Daidang conference, they could speak out more freely because at the UN conference, they had to be careful what they were saying because they were there representing their countries. But at the Daidang conference, they were free to speak. So that was, yeah. And finally, they ran out of money. They couldn't continue anymore. And that I think Daidang came from a longer sentence. I don't speak Vietnamese, but it was the original name was Daidang Thay Joy, which means
great togetherness
great
of the
togetherness.
world.
Yes,
of the world.
yes. So and there was a book that came out about that by Tom Arton about that.
Oh, really?
Do you have that? Yes.
No. Okay.
I have one copy. I can send you the title. And I'm sure you can find it.
Yeah, I'll find it. Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
No, we have a little brosure, but I didn't know that.
Yeah,
was
I have the brochure too, but there was a book written about that conference. There's a guy who took notes. Yeah.
He's finding new things. And in speaking about Daidang, I forgot that your father did return to Vietnam. So there was this, which he described in Saigon, USA. He went back to try to connect with the student organizers. So Cao Ngoc Phung, Chi Phung, Sister Shan Kong, has still in Vietnam during that time, still with the School of Youth for Social Service, although Hanh University, after she organizes the students to speak out for peace, she gets the SYSS gets cut off from Hanh University by the rector, who was a monk, Thich Minh Châu. So that they have no institutional support anymore. And so your father goes and meets with Chi Phung, meets with the students there. I think they plan to do a fast, and he comes back, takes out an ad from the New York Times,
They were trying to raise money for the Student School of Youth for Social Service.
Tries to get support.
But do you know the story about his trying to see Thich Quang and Thich Quang
refusing
to see him?
You tell it. Sorry.
So Alfred wanted to talk to Thich Quang, who was the great leader of this whole movement. But Thich Quang had been fasting for 100 days, and he had taken a vow not to speak to any American until the war was over. And so he refused to meet with my father. And I mentioned this sense of humor, right? So he tries a couple of times, and he's there with Sister Chan Kong, with Chifeng,
Your father, who had come all the way
who had
to
come all the
Vietnam
way to Vietnam
just to see
from
him.
New York to see
Mainly.
him. And so, he tries, and no, the Venerable will not speak with you. No, he has taken a vow, and this vow is holy, and he will not break his vow. And then my dad, who knew that Thich Quang had just completed a 100-day hunger strike, he writes him a letter, and he says, Dear Venerable Thich Quang, I have come all the way across the world to see you at the request of your colleague Thich Nhat Hanh. Just as I do not blame you for being Vietnamese just because General Key is also Vietnamese, I don't think you should blame me for being an American just because Lyndon Johnson is an American. I've traveled all this way, and I will sit on your doorstep and do a hunger strike until you see me. And he tells this story, my father, we have it on tape, and he says, and Fung, she said, oh, Alfred, he will be very upset because he's very venerable. And I said, well, I think I'm pretty venerable myself. and he says, because I figure any person who had been such a leader and been able to stay strong in the midst of all this, he must have a sense of humor. He must have a sense of humor. So he slid the note under his door, and he sat on the doorstep. And the door opens, and there's Thich Quang with this big grin on his face. And they had hours of meetings then. So
he understood Vietnamese culture.
He understood something very important about human beings.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Is there anything more kind of in the 70s you'd like to share? You were now in your 20s. Maybe share, I'd like to know more about this trip that you were sent on to Vietnam under a pseudonym.
Right. So, I was working then. After I graduated from college, I joined a Quaker protest movement against chemical and biological weapons which were being used in Vietnam, which was like demonstrating long marches and then walking onto army bases and getting arrested, stuff like that. Then I worked for an organization that was taking care. It was a medical organization for war-injured Vietnamese children. And they were bringing children who were severely injured and couldn't be cared for in Vietnam. They were bringing them to the United States for medical procedures. But it was also an advocacy organization because they were publishing photographs and stories. And I mean, this is the horror of war. Look at it, Americans, look at it. So I was their executive secretary for about a year, I think, in Philadelphia. And so Thay and Alfred had thought that, a little bit of background is that there was a big split in the American and European peace movements about what they should be demanding. And the group that was listening to the Vietnamese Buddhists and respecting and trying to support them was advocating for an immediate ceasefire. Start with stopping the killing. And the other group, which was not following the Vietnamese Buddhists and was, I would say, understandably, mainly outraged at the American policies and the American presence in Vietnam and the war which was destroying this country, and felt sympathy to the armed resistance, even the pacifists, to the Viet Cong and to the North Vietnamese, the National Liberation Front and the North Vietnamese. And their political demand was not an immediate ceasefire. In fact, they were opposed to that because they said if there's an immediate ceasefire, it will leave the Americans in power in South Vietnam. So the first demand has to be a complete U.S. withdrawal of American troops before we'll talk, basically. That was the split. And even within the FOR, this split played out. And there was a lot of real acrimony here, even to the point of some peace leaders who were on the side of the no, American withdrawal is first, even accusing like my dad and Thay of being connected to the CIA or being agents of this, this kind of smears within the peace movement.
Yeah, on the left.
On the left, indeed. And even continuing on into after the war ended, it just continued. There was all of this character assassination.
Course,
but anyway, so their idea in doing something again to promote, to try to put pressure for a ceasefire was what they called the Stop the Killing campaign. And part of the Stop the Killing campaign, it was an advocacy campaign. It was PR, it was writing things, and they were collecting support for a petition among members of governments around the world who would, these things still happen, of course, but this was, and Thay and Chifeng thought that at that point, there were a number of members of the South Vietnamese parliament who called themselves neutralists. And they thought that by then, this is 1971, the war had been going on for so long, that they thought maybe there would be willingness among some of them to sign this petition, which would have given it a lot more power, was the idea, if there are actually Vietnamese legislators signing this petition for a ceasefire. But Thay and Chifeng were in exile in Paris. And my father couldn't get a visa because he published Saigon USA and done all these other things, so he couldn't get in. So he asked me to go and to persuade them.
And you got a name from Thay.
Yeah, Judy Forilla. So Judy is my sister's name, and Forilla was FOR gorilla. No, it was full of cloak and dagger stuff. I couldn't. There was no possibility of getting. I'm not sure if we tried to get a visa for me to go into Vietnam in Washington. Maybe.
Did you have a passport or in that name?
Well, I had an American passport. Yeah.
But in that name, not in that.
No. No, that was just for correspondence. If to send a telegram or something.
Okay.
So I couldn't get a visa. But they said, come to Paris anyway, we'll figure something out. So I flew to Paris. And then they said, okay, you certainly can't get a visa here in Paris because it's too politicized. It was that was the whole exiled Vietnamese and the Paris peace talks and so forth. It's too politicized. That won't work. They will never give you a visa. So here's the thing that they've cooked up. I was going to be a student of ethnomusicology, doing my degree in Oriental music, and I was going to attend a conference in Tokyo. And I was going to ask for a visa, a transit visa for Saigon, for Vietnam, because I needed to find a moon-shaped lute. So they bought me a ticket for Tokyo, and I think the night before or 2 nights before I left Paris to go to Switzerland to try to get this visa, I read the backs of all these record jackets of Vietnamese music so that I could learn something about this moon-shaped lute and pretend that I was a graduate student. And I am a musician, so I could speak sort of musician's language, but I definitely didn't know anything about the moon-shaped lute. And then I took the train to Bern I think it was Bern in Switzerland, which is where the Vietnamese embassy was. First, I went to the Japanese embassy and got a stamp in my passport so that I could, and I had my ticket already for Tokyo.
Kind of legitimate.
Yeah. And then I went to the Vietnamese embassy and I told my story about being a graduate student going to a conference in Tokyo. Oh, very nice. Got my visa. So then I took the night train back to Paris, and then they put me on a plane to Vietnam from there. So that's how I got into Vietnam at the age of 20.
And you had letters to hand deliver.
I had handwritten letters from Thay, which I had to hand deliver. And I had them hidden in my toilet kit and between my maps. And I also had instructions. Like, with this one, you should speak French, because I did speak some French. With this one, you should speak English. With this one, you have to approach it this way. With that one, you have to approach it that way. So I had to learn all this. And don't mention this name to this one. And, and so, and then I landed in Saigon, this long trip via Thailand. And the guy ahead of me was so thoroughly searched that we used to have traveler's checks before there was internet. They looked in between every one of his traveler's checks. They checked everything. And I was standing there. I was sweating. I was so nervous. I wasn't afraid of. I mean, the war wasn't. There was no fighting war in Saigon at that point, and I was only going to be in Saigon. I wasn't scared for myself. I was mostly proud that I could finally do something. All these years of demonstrating, and I could do something that was important, that could contribute. And then I came, and so I was kind of flirting with the guy, and I mean, it's like the letter under the. You do what you do. This is, and they open up my suitcase, and on the top is a box of chocolates that the woman in Switzerland who had helped me had sent, because she had also been on a spy mission at some point, and she wanted me to take chocolates to one of the people she had met, one of the students at the School of Youth for Social Service. And the guy looks at the box. He says, "What's in that box?" I said, "Chocolates." He said, "I need to search." I said, "Go ahead." So he opens the box, and sure enough, there are chocolates. He said, "Okay, I believe you." Close it, and I got through. Never looked at my toilet kit, never looked at my maps, nothing. I mean, okay. So I was there for 5 days. And Chifung's brother drove me around from place to place. I also went to the
singer.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember.
Okay.
He used to come and sing every year in Plum Village.
Yeah.
Quite
and
dramatic.
I can't remember where I stayed. I think at her family's house. I stayed at her mother's house, I think.
Okay. But then they had a house in Saigon.
In Saigon, yeah. And I visited the School of Youth for Social Service. I met Thich. I met Thich Thanh Van, who was Thay's associate there.
He hadn't been hit by the. Yeah,
this was before he was killed. Yes, I found this. This is a letter I wrote in 1972 when I was there, and it mentions him. So,
so Thich Thanh Van is, I think, Nguyen Hung in the Fragrant Palm Leaves. So if you actually, Fragrant Palm Leaves, the book in Vietnamese is called Neo Ve Cu Y, which is the path of the mind, or the path to return of the mind. It's actually written as a letter to Thay Thanh Van. Before he was Thay Thanh Van, he was Nguyen Van. He lived with Thay in the Fragrant Palm Leaves Hermitage. That's what we're going to be talking about this week. So.
And I was with them in Paris when they got
very close with Thay, and he was the director of the School of Youth for Social Service. Yeah.
And he was hit by a car, and then the American
hospital
GI
truck.
Yeah. And then the American hospital refused to treat him, and they drove him in the back of a truck somewhere far away, and then he died of his wounds. Yeah. And I was with them in Paris, then working with them when they got that news. And
Thay, I think for many days he could not talk to anyone.
Oh, it was horrible.
Yeah.
It was horrible. But so anyway.
So you had a chance to meet Thay.
I did meet him, yes. And I met some.
I've heard he's so gentle and.
Oh. And I met some of the Buddhist leaders, the youth leaders, and got some of those signatures. That was easy, of course. And then I met with a number of the parliamentarians, and I think we got 16 or 17 of their signatures. And then so I sent a Judy Farrell telegram with the names of the of the signatories. And then so that was successful, but the Christmas bombing happened right after that.
Yeah, Nixon.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Nixon, Johnson, they all did it,
Yeah.
It doesn't matter so much. I guess here we are on election day. The war
Today,
machine,
yes.
the war machine carries on. And if you stand and oppose it, also as political leader, you'll be removed. Mm. So anyway, I mean, I had to go somewhere. I think in Vietnam already I could change my flight. So instead of Tokyo, I went to Hong Kong, and then I flew back from there to Paris.
We have a few more minutes before lunch. I want to ask about when your father passed away. Yeah. So we're going forward, I think, to 91?
91.
91.
Yeah.
So this very heartwarming story where Thay comes and massages his feet.
Yeah.
Could you...
Yeah, so I was coming over to see my dad, and he was dying. He was in hospital in Suffolk, New York. And my cousin, who's an artist in New York, had written to me that Thich Nhat Hanh would be speaking in New York, and she was going to go, and would I like to go? And I said, well, I'm going to be with Alfred. It was a distance. And I said, if I don't show up, it means that it's serious and I can't leave him. So would you tell them that, please? And she did. And the next day they walked in the door of the hospital room. And Thay massaged his feet. He hadn't spoken at all. He was heavily sedated. He was in the last phases of cancer. And Fung, Sister Chung Kong, was talking to him about all the things that they had done together. I was like, Alfred, remember when we did this? And I remember the Montauk Conference, and remember when you threatened Thich Tri Quang with a hunger strike, and all these wonderful things. Remember the School of Youth for Social Service. Remember all of those things that we did together. And he opened his eyes and he said, wonderful. And he said it twice. And those were the last words he spoke. He died that night. Yeah. So, it was a long time ago, but ever present. But I always felt like this was, and then when we were doing the research for the film about the stories, all of these stories, I have the film I have the original film I told you on a flash drive. We could look at it at some point if you want. But we were going to go to Plum Village with the filmmakers to interview them. And the dates kept changing, and, the way it happens. And then suddenly they said, we had tickets already. And they said, well, could you come to our center outside Cologne instead, because Thay's going to be there.
Sorry.
So we changed everything and we went there. And I realized going there that we would be there on exactly the 20th anniversary of the passing of my father. And I told them that. And they organized...
2011.
Yeah, yeah. And they organized a ceremony.
A ceremony. I was there.
Yeah, were you there?
Yes.
Oh, bless. Yeah.
It's beautiful.
That was very beautiful.
Yeah, so I think we'll share with everyone on the course the link where Thay shares so beautifully about your father.
Yeah.
He says that he is as successful as a family, successful as an activist, successful. He lived a good life.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's very beautiful what Thay says.
Yeah. He said, Thay nominates him Thich Hassler.
The Buddhist Baptist.
Buddhist Baptist. Yeah.
Well, I could go on for another 2 hours, and we're very lucky Laura's here for another few days, so we'll have a chance to just talk informally, and hope you get to meet more of the brothers and sisters and our lay friends who are here.
Could I close by reading this one paragraph that I found? As I brought all of this stuff, I have a lot of these old letters and correspondence and photos and stuff. And I didn't read this until this morning, but it's a letter that I wrote from Paris when I was there in 1972, trying to raise money, basically, for their work to support orphans and so. And reading it, I was reminded of, I mentioned that one of the places where we work as Musicians Without Borders is Palestine. And the horror of what has been happening in Gaza, now in Lebanon, also in the West Bank where our project is, and the ways in which people are shut down about saying anything, and the ways in which people become tired of paying attention, even though we can see every day children's bodies being blown up. Israeli soldiers, IDF soldiers, dancing and making fun of having, destroyed people's homes. The American regime, whoever becomes president, which just accepts and finances this. And sorry, but this is, and I found this paragraph and I thought, wow, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. So I'd just like to share it with you because I feel like this is where we are now, but then in a different setting. Vietnam does not get so much news these days, and we are all tired of hearing about it. But there has been more killing, maiming, and destroying there in the past 5 months than in any other period of the war. Some of those deaths have been much-loved friends of my gentle friends here. One was Thich Van, a Zen monk who directed the School of Youth for Social Service, and whom I met when I was in Vietnam last year. To feel such grief for every victim of this brutal war, no one could bear it. But to think of each victim as a person, an individual, and a mother, and a member of the same human family, perhaps if more of us could, the war would end.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Laura.
Thank you.
And so many more questions and things, but I think we'll have a chance to
We can continue.
have lunch together and continue. So maybe for this session, we'll finish with 3 sounds of the bell. Thank you so much for coming all this way.
Please look up Musicians Without Borders. Please send us a donation. Please see our corporate giving page if you know anybody who is involved in businesses that would like to support important work in the world.
The Musicians
Yeah.
Without Borders,
Yeah, if you can. We're struggling.
Yeah, okay.
Don't want it to go the way Daidang went. And we've been there for 25 years.
I think, we've been doing this music festival here the past 2 years, and when I told some of the organizers about your work, their eyes lit up, and so hopefully we'll have more fruitful conversations about this.
Okay, let's do that. Thank you everybody for being here and for listening to all these old stories.